fraud in our organizations, and as well as he'll touch on some information regarding compliance requirements with regards to this, and certain requirements that the state has for us in doing these assessments. And so we would really like to thank Seth for joining us today. He was very friendly and super willing to come and help with this presentation. And I know that this is a good opportunity for him too, to be able to get with so many of us in one place. So we'll go ahead and turn the balance of the time over to Seth.
Thank you, Doug. I appreciate it. So let me get this screen shared correctly. Can everybody see? Can you see that, Doug?
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. So what I'd really like to go through today, we're going to talk about our fraud risk assessment. As many of the organization and the trust understand, this has been a new requirement. It was put into effect in 2020. And the bad part of the timing on that was it happened about the same time as the pandemic hit. And so implementation for it has been a little bit difficult for the governmental entities. But first, we want to talk a little bit about why we went through that one, why we've done this. So this is the Report to the Nations, the government edition. Hopefully, if anybody wants something really interesting to read, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners put out what they call the Report to the Nations. So if you were to look up Report to the Nations or Report to the Nations Government Edition, they do one of these reports every year, and they total the numbers, the cases of fraud, the size of different cases of fraud, and the different things that happen with them. Here's one that's kind of interesting. It has the different behaviors that show up in that little chart on the right, behavioral attributes of people that commit fraud in governmental entities. This is one that, I think it's very interesting. I've watched several cases of fraud across the state. And this is their report. It's their kind of capstone report they do it each year. As we talk about fraud and we visualize what fraud looks like, this is my favorite visual representation of it. There's pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. And as we kind of go through the presentation, just think of those. When those three align, that's when you usually end up with a fraud. The first thing we talk about is pressure. So common pressures that can affect employees can be a simple desire to keep up with their peers or live beyond their means. It could be medical bills. It could be unexpected financial needs. It could be caused by different types of addictions. And there's really not anything that you can do as an entity to change the pressures that are going to affect your employees' lives. They're living, they have things happening to them, they have kids, they have deaths in their families, and life will go on, and you can't control that. With that said, there are some employers that have required their employees to take a budgeting or a financial planning course. Of course, that's why we do retirement planning, and we have pension plans and 401ks, is to help relieve some of that burden as people progress in their careers and they're getting closer to retirement. They're not scared that they're not going to be taken care of. That's why those things exist. We also help insurance and advise them on those things so that they can learn how to prepare for and deal with the pressures of life as they come around. One thing that an employer can do is to pay attention to its staff and be aware of the pressures that they have. Having good relations, having a good HR department, having good managers, and being aware that those different things are happening in people's lives. We've done a whole bunch of cases in the state of different frauds or different things that we've come in and we've talked to the person that was in charge or the supervisor of an individual after a fraud case, and their comments have been, well, we didn't know. We didn't know that she was in that kind of situation. And if they had, they may have been more understanding or more pending of what was happening with the books. So that's the first side of that fraud triangle, is the pressure. The next is rationalization. and there's all different kinds of rationalization that people can go through when they commit a fraud. One of the biggest is the "I'll pay it back" rationalization. We had several cases of fraud in the state where, as the case has gone on and they were called on the carpet on it, the clerk or whoever has actually been able to provide all of the receipts. They had documented their own fraud very, very well. And the reason why that's happened is because their mentality was, we were just borrowing it. We intended to give it back all along. And they just never did, because it snowballed and it got bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, those kind of employees that have rationalized it in that way, they're usually quite shocked that it got as big as it did. You know, what went from just making it through the next paycheck turns into $100,000 or $200,000 very quickly. The other rationalization that you see is the "I deserve it." Maybe somebody was passed up for a promotion. They didn't get the cost of living increase that they were expecting. And so they start to do things to make it right. They want to get what they deserve. Again, a lot of the times when confronted after the fraud, they realize, oh, well, I took a lot more than I thought I was damaged. And then the last one, which is kind of an interesting one that I've seen several times in the state, is that it doesn't hurt anyone. For instance, if I take this, it's small, or if I just take the car home, even though I'm not supposed to, or I'm using this vehicle for personal use instead of the other, I'm not really hurting anyone. It's not like I'm stealing money. It's just using this thing, and nobody else was going to use it, so it's fine. That one is one that I think is quite dangerous, because it sets a tone and other people in the organization see it. And then they start to rationalize it the same way. Well, that one doesn't hurt anyone. Well, I saw him do it. And then they start to rationalize it, and it kind of poisons the entire organization. And that tone at the top becomes very difficult. When it comes to rationalization, there are a couple of things that are on the fraud risk assessment that deal with rationalization. In different studies, annual ethics trainings and declarations of ethical conduct are designed to affect the rationalization. Having to affirm every year, I'm going to be an honest person, I'm not going to do this, or I am going to report this if I see it, helps the person set what otherwise might be a gray area. It helps put it in a black and white thing. And that is why those are on the fraud risk assessment. Then the next side of that fraud triangle is opportunity. And this is the one that we focus on most when we're dealing with fraud, not just in governmental entities, but in all entities. It's because this is the side of that fraud triangle that the employer actually has control. So opportunity arises when you have ignorant or apathetic people that are in charge. If you have a disengaged board member that's not looking over the thing, and it's a small entity with a disengaged board, then it makes it so that the people that are working underneath that board know that, you know, the reconciliation is not going to be reviewed, or they've never been asked about doing a reconciliation. Over their shoulder, no one's reviewing that reconciliation, then different things can go onto it and people won't know. Another one is a poor audit trail. We just had a recent fraud in northern Utah that it's still in the process of being sorted out. Their 2019 audit has not been finalized because they discovered this fraud. And one of the reasons why is because the person muddied the water. So as is pretty typical, if I'm going to be stealing from things, sometimes I'll start doing other things and making other transactions that are hard for someone to understand. As that water gets more muddy with different things going back and forth, it's easier to hide what they're stealing. And so if there's a poor audit trail or it's difficult to trace through transactions, that is kind of a tip off that something could be happening. Whereas if you have you remove that opportunity by keeping a clear chain of command, keeping processes documented so that a new fresh set of eyes could come in and walk through the transaction, that helps to clean up that audit trail, and it makes it more understandable. It makes it harder for fraud to happen. Asymmetrical information, where one employee or board member controls or understands more than anyone else in management. Great example of this, if you want a fun show to watch later tonight, look on Netflix and watch All the Queen's Horses, which is a documentary of Dixon, Illinois, and the largest municipal fraud in US history, about $53 million. And that was all possible because you had a small office with one employee that controlled all of the information and then disseminated the pieces of information to different people to keep everybody else in the dark. It's quite an interesting documentary. They did a pretty good job on that if you want to look at that later. Inadequate training, if you don't have people that know what they're looking for, or they don't know what the policies are, or they haven't been trained on the policies, it makes it easier to commit fraud. And then trust is important. So we hire people that we trust, but trust is also often used as an excuse not to perform your due diligence. I trust someone to do it right, so I don't need to review that. We like the phrase trust but verify a lot better. We trust people, we hire good people, but we verify what's happened to make sure that it happened correctly. So what happens when you cross the line? When somebody crosses the line and a fraud actually occurs, we look at the fraud triangle as those things, elements that push someone into committing fraud. If we can prevent it, and we can prevent them from crossing that line, we're much better off. There's less time and effort and energy lost in recovering funds or tracking it down. Forensic audits are expensive and difficult to do. But once somebody has crossed the line, then we come into, well, the act itself, how did they commit it? And then usually, how did they hide it or the cover up? And both of those are important as you see or hear cases of fraud or your concerns about things. Those are two questions that should be asked: is how would it happen and how would it be covered up or hidden from the auditors or from staff or from management or whatever. So if you look at that report to the nations, the funds or the assets of an entity are the most common thing that are taken. Another way, other things that can be taken, they can take services or something else. For instance, we had in 2018, there was a pretty large case of fraud in a small municipality in central Utah. And, in addition to stealing assets, they had also put in like their utility fee and connection fee for water that were services that had been provided, but not actually funds being taken from the entity, but receiving that connection free of charge is a service that could be stolen. So utilities, water, things like that can also be taken. But one of the best ways to safeguard the funds and the assets of the entity is to make sure that they're recorded. And one of my favorite restaurants, or my kids' favorite restaurants, is Panda Express. And if you go to Panda Express, you'll see a sign that they have by their till. And I could give bonus points to anybody that could chime in and tell me what that says, if anybody's interested in interjecting. But I don't see any takers. So the sign says, if you don't get a receipt, it's free. And the reason why that's in there is because that is a control that restaurant has put into place to make sure that the people running the till actually ring it up and charge the customer, and that it gets recorded into their accounting system. Because otherwise they could just say, oh, well, that was $10. The person would hand them the $10. They could put it in their pocket and they could get away with it. But since it was rang up and they gave a receipt that was generated by their accounting system, it's in the system. Once it's in the system, in order for that employee to steal that same amount of money, they would have to go in and do some other transaction, um, void out the transaction, apply a credit, or do some sort of adjustment. Those are the same things that would have to happen in like a municipality's system for utility payments or whatever else. If you can get it into the system and you have a good system of recording all of the transactions on receipt of those, of any kind of funds coming in, then there has to be a second type of transaction to void or apply a credit or make an adjustment. That usually involves falsifying documents or going around some other controls, like having the same person reviewing and doing the reconciliation on an account that they do. So if someone's reconciling the credit card statement, but also has a credit card, then they can pay that themselves and cover it up. So that's kind of the basis of why we have that fraud risk assessment, is to address that fraud triangle. The fraud risk assessment itself is available at auditor.utah.gov/resources. There's a section for fraud. There's an implementation guide, and there's the actual questionnaire. The other link that's here is the ACFE's report to the nations for 2020. It has some different things that are really interesting if you want to look at them. You know, what the typical fraudster in the United States looks like, their age, their profile. I think it's interesting is when you look at that, most of those cases, in most cases of fraud, at least in governmental entities, the person has never had a prior conviction. It's not something that you're going to screen out in your interviewing process. What happens is a person gets into that situation, they have the pressure that's affecting them, they're presented with the opportunity, and then they're able to justify what they do. And whenever the pressure and the justification and the opportunity is greater than that person's moral compass, then that's when you end up with problems. So the fraud risk assessment itself, this is what it looks like. This is the questionnaire. There's those 9 questions. The first one, there's the first section that talks about separation of duties, which is what we believe is key. Separation of duties is by far the most important thing. That question was designed originally as it's an all or nothing thing. There's 200 points there, because if there's a poor separation of duties in one area, then it allows for the circumnavigation of those controls. The next section is what we consider different policies and things that we have in place that management can do. So conflict of interest policies, procurement policies, having licensed or certified staff, education, training. And the last part deals with internal audit functions. This is a starting off point. It's a fraud risk assessment. And that's the important thing that people need to understand. This is a tool. It's what we put together. It's not meant to be the end all be all of assessing the risks in the entity. For instance, there is nothing on here that talks about inventory controls in the sheriff's office. But how catastrophic would it be if a police department were to lose some of their firearms and someone were to get a hold of them and murder someone with a government issued firearm? It'd be pretty catastrophic. And that might be an extreme example, but there's no question on here on that. But as you go through, that should be something that is considered. You know, do we have inventory things that need to be taken care of, like firearms that are being replaced? Well, do we just keep them and keep them in a storeroom because they're decommissioned firearms from public safety officers? What about, you know, how evidence is disposed? Or if you run an ambulance service, what about the medicines that you may have on that ambulance? Are those things that can be stolen? How hard would that be to replace, or how bad would it be for the municipality or the district if something like that happened? Those are risks. And as an entity does their risk assessment, they should look at all of those risks. maybe there's something that's on here that really needs to be addressed by your entity because you're a special purpose government that is not on here. Well, this is a starting off point. And from there, you talk about other risks, and other questions should be asked. All of the board members should answer the question before you go through this and you talk about it in your board meeting. You should ask the question, what keeps me up at night? What am I worried about? What could go bad? And you take all of those together and you talk about them. Well, I think it would go really bad if, like my example with the police department and they lost a gun. Well, maybe I have a background in law enforcement and that's what I'm worried about. But somebody else will have a completely different background. They may be worried about other things. You talk about all of those risks, and then you come up with a plan of, well, these are things that we can put in place. Maybe you lean on an external auditor, or maybe you hire a fee account to help you put different things in place. But that's the whole point of this fraud risk assessment, is to get the ball rolling and to start those conversations so that the entity can be better prepared for any contingency that comes along, including fraud. This is from the report to the nations. These are the most common detection method, and the most common is from tips. By far, that's the largest. That's why we've recommended on that fraud risk assessment, the adoption of a fraud or tip line, a hotline. It doesn't have to be owned by the entity itself. You could pull together as an association or another group, or a group of municipalities or whatever could pull together and perform one. But having a mechanism in place that people can report tips, internal audit, external audit, management's review, those are all different things about how those frauds are detected. Now, down lower, so account reconciliation, it's only 3% of how frauds are detected. But if you were to look at the flip side of how they are prevented, that would be much higher up the list. It's just harder to quantify. So it looks like we're getting about finished with our time. I will talk just really briefly about the risk assessment. There currently are a couple of requirements. The first is that it's done. So it should be done, it should be performed. The governing body is responsible for making sure that happens, and they can assign that to a staff member. They can do it themselves. If they do it themselves, I'm sure there will be lots of communication with their clerk or their recorder to gather that information. So that it's completed, it's signed on the bottom by the chief administrative officer and the chief financial officer, and that is submitted to our office at reporting.auditor.utah.gov, our state reporting portal. And we receive those. The other requirement is that that it is talked about in a board meeting. And what I was talking about before, going through that fraud risk assessment process, that is the conversation that we want to have. It needs to be put on an agenda and discussed. If there are specific things that need to be discussed because there's worries in a specific department, it would be appropriate to go into a closed session if it was advertised correctly that you could go into a closed session to discuss the character or competency of an individual and address those concerns if there are specific ones that you have identified, and then come back out and take care of things. But that fraud risk assessment can and should be done in a meeting and discussed, and hopefully coming out of that meeting, you have an action plan of, you know what, we need to revise this policy, or we need to adopt a policy, or maybe we should look into different things. It's supposed to start a process, and it will be done every year to bring those controls to the forefront of people's minds, and they can improve year after year and help, avoid fraud in the state of Utah. That's the whole goal. So with that, I think we have a few minutes left. I'd love to answer any questions if there are any.
All right, let's see. We have a question from Linda. How can you justify penalizing small entities that cannot afford to hire a CPA? Or what if there is not a CPA available to hire?
Okay, that is a great question. There are a lot of places in smaller towns and smaller areas where there might not be the resources to do that. And it's not We don't look at this as penalizing. It's more of a self-awareness thing. So yes, there is a score, there's a ranking on the fraud risk assessment, and it's more designed to be able to let you know where you are at. So there's nothing else happening with that scoring. It's helping you say, for people to be able to understand the scoring is very low risk, a low risk, moderate risk, high, or very high. And if you look at those, they're very similar to what everyone should be familiar with from school. You got 90% of the points possible. It's kind of like an A, B, C, D. And it's just to help some of the board members and staff to understand where they would fall if it were more like the school setting. But it doesn't mean that if I'm a small district, I don't have to have a CPA on staff. I need to recognize that if I don't have a CPA on staff, I may need to obtain those resources from some other place. Maybe there's a city or a county that created my district that has some of those resources, and I know that I need to lean on them, or I need to contract it out to be able to operate properly and not have problems. So it's more a self-awareness thing, not a penalty.
Okay. Looking for questions here. We had some agreement there. One other question as far as a training requirement. Is that the board meeting that you talked about, or the council meeting?
So there's a training requirement in there. One of them is a board member training. And if you go to training.auditor.utah.gov, there's a required board member training for each different entity type. So there's one for municipal officials, one for districts, one for county officials, one for nonprofit entities. Board members are required to be trained once every time they're appointed. So if they're appointed to a 4-year term, they would receive that training in their first year, and it's good for 4 years. And then if they're reappointed, they'd have to take it again. That's actually required by statute. That's one training that's mentioned in a fraud risk assessment. The other is training for staff. We recommend 40 hours of training that goes with professional standards. I'm a CPA, I'm an accountant, so a lot of those same sort of things rely heavily on what the accounting profession determines what's required for continuing ed. But those trainings, not the board member trainings, but the trainings for staff, can be anything that you believe you need. So if you want to train on how to use Excel, or how to use your accounting system, or this training would qualify as those. The idea is that we're making training a bigger emphasis and trying to keep track of it, and actually having a goal of getting a certain number of training hours in so that people are better prepared to do their job.
It's just a clarification on that, Seth. That training, when we talk about staff, is that just for the accounting staff, financial staff, or is it broader than that? So
we left it rather broad. The training, what we describe is a member of the management done, and purposely we did it that way so that the entity has to decide who is management. They have to decide who's managing the ship, and they have to decide who's going to receive that training. So instead of us coming in and saying, well, the executive director, well, we don't have an executive director, we have a mayor. We just said management, and they can define it who they want to have receive that training.
Okay, great. Not seeing other questions, folks. If you got any questions, type those into the chat box. We're about to wrap up, but if you've got a burning question, type that in the chat box, and we'll pitch that to Seth right now.
Seth, I'd just ask you if you could maybe address how this not only protects the entity, but how it protects the individual, that works for the entity who has some of these financial responsibilities.
Well, in government especially, that's a great question. In government especially, reputation is a very important thing. And having good controls in place protects the employees a lot. And you see it many times, having worked in local government and stuff myself, where somebody will accuse somebody of saying, well, they stole a couple $1 million from here. And in those entities that the controls are in place, it's very easy to come back and say, No, that would be impossible, because if I stole a couple $1 million, this person would have seen me and this person would have seen me and I would have been caught. And you can very easily prove by going to looking at those reports, hey, we have it separated out. It's impossible for me to do that. I'm not even a signer on the account. I print the checks, but I cannot do that. And then this person over here is reconciling the bank account, so they would see any weird transfers and stuff. So I couldn't have done that. And it keeps my name good and clean for the community, because people get involved in government. At a great part, it's not because of the pay, it's because they have a sense of civic duty. They want to help out with that small water board. Well, nothing destroys that spirit of volunteerism like being accused of doing something you didn't do. And those controls keep the board members and keep the staff protected, and the entity, because the entity doesn't want a black eye either. So as long as those are in place, those separation of duties, it keeps everybody safe and wanting to continue to live in the community that they're in. So.
Okay, just a couple more questions came in. Let's see. Thank you for clarifying what qualifies as training. I assume we can add all of the small trainings together to get the 40 hours annually?
Yep.
Okay. And the other question was, would city council members take the local district and special service district board member training 2021 or introductory training for municipal officers 2021 to meet the assessment requirement?
So if you're on a city council, you would take the introduction to the municipal training. The only reason a municipal official would have to take the district training is if, as part of their duties as being on the city council, they were also on a district board. Those trainings are specific, and there are different requirements that districts have to do that cities don't. So if I'm on the city council, I'm also on the water board, and it's a special service district, I get the joy of having to do both. And that's just, I wish that we could do one that was comprehensive, but because there are laws that are specific to districts that don't apply to municipalities, we have split those up. There is some overlap, but it's just the way it is. I wish I could make it shorter for you.
Okay. Well, that looks like all of the questions that we've had come in. Thank you very much for that great presentation, clarifying all this information out there. Do you have some final words for us today?
Just that we thank you. The people of the state of Utah, and especially those that work with governments, are the cream of the crop. And we know that you work hard, and we know that it can be a very thankless job and a monotonous job, but the people in the state need good people that will do those and take care of the governments that take care of the services in our community. So we appreciate you. If there's anything that we can do for you, we have a local government resource center. If there's any resources, or you have questions or need help, my email address is there. You can look at our website. And I'm available by phone most of the time, unless I'm in a meeting. Leave a message and I'll give you a call back.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Seth. We appreciate you taking some time out of your schedule today to talk with the trust members out here, and definitely use Seth as a resource if you have questions on this. We know this is kind of new to many of you out there, and so if you do have specific questions, definitely contact Seth. All right. Thank you so much. Folks, we appreciate your attendance today, and make sure to sign up for our YouTube channel so you can get the recording for this. We'll be posting that up later today, and you can share that with your boards and others out there so they really understand what the requirements are as well. Thanks so much, folks. Go out and have a great day.